My parents begged me to give my brother part of my liver when I was 14, then told me to do it again when I was 17 and called me selfish for hesitating. The consult room smelled like hand sanitizer and old coffee. Dr. Okafor set a folder on the table between us. My mother didn't wait for her to open it. She reached across and grabbed my hand, squeezing hard enough that my knuckles ached. "You said yes last time," she said. "You can say yes again." I was 17. The last time had been 3 years earlier, in a room down the same hallway, with the same beige walls and the same box of tissues nobody ever used because nobody in my family cried in front of doctors. My brother Wyatt was 2 floors up, hooked to machines that beeped in a rhythm I'd learned to hate. "I haven't said anything yet," I said. My father cleared his throat. "Delaney, your brother is dying." Dr. Okafor opened her mouth like she wanted to slow things down, add context, explain the actual numbers. My mother talked over her. "We don't have time for you to think about it," she said. "Every day you think about it is a day he doesn't have." I looked at the folder. I hadn't touched it yet. I already knew what was inside, because I'd read the same kind of folder at 14, sitting in a chair too big for me, signing forms I didn't fully understand because my mother had her hand on my shoulder the whole time, pressing down. "I need to think," I said. My mother's face did something I recognized. It wasn't sadness. It was calculation, dressed up as sadness. "After everything he's done for this family," she said, "you need to think." Wyatt hadn't done anything for this family except need things from it. I didn't say that out loud. I'd learned by 17 exactly which sentences got you branded selfish in my house, and that one was near the top of the list. "I'll give you my answer tomorrow," I said, and stood up before either of them could grab my hand again. My father called after me into the hallway. "Delaney, we raised you better than this." I kept walking. The elevator took 40 seconds to arrive, and in that time, I thought about the scar under my ribs, the one that still pulled when I laughed too hard, the one I'd carried since I was 14 years old and agreed to give my brother a piece of my body because my parents told me it was the only right thing to do. I was about to find out it hadn't even worked the way they'd told me it would. I was born in Dayton, Ohio, in a hospital 11 minutes from the house I grew up in. My parents, Greg and Renata Voss, married young and had Wyatt first, then me 3 years later, in October of 2006. My father ran a heating and cooling business out of a shop off Wayne Avenue. My mother taught 4th grade at Fairview Elementary. We weren't rich. We weren't poor. We were the kind of family that clipped coupons and still managed a week at a rented cabin near Lake Erie every July. Wyatt was diagnosed with Wilson's disease when he was 15. I was 12. Nobody in our family had heard of it before that spring. It's a genetic disorder, rare, where the body can't process copper correctly, and the copper builds up instead of flushing out, and it settles into organs and starts destroying them from the inside. Wyatt's first symptom was fatigue so bad he slept through an entire Thanksgiving. His second symptom was his eyes turning the color of old parchment. My mother took him to urgent care thinking it was mono. 6 weeks and 4 specialists later, a hepatologist at Cincinnati Children's Hospital told my parents that Wyatt's liver was failing and that without intervention, he had maybe 2 years. I remember the night my parents came home from that appointment because it was the last ordinary dinner our family ever had. My mother had made spaghetti, the same recipe she always made on Tuesdays, and halfway through the meal, my father set down his fork and told Wyatt and me, in a voice that didn't sound like his own, that Wyatt was sick, seriously sick, and that things were going to be different for a while. Wyatt, 15 and scared in a way I'd never seen him before, asked how different. Nobody answered him directly. I remember thinking, even at 12, that the silence after his question was its own kind of answer, one nobody in the room wanted to say out loud yet. The diagnosis came with a name, Wilson's disease, and a treatment plan that started with halation therapy, medication meant to pull the excess copper out of his system, along with a strict low-copper diet that meant no more shellfish, no more chocolate, no more of the mushroom risotto my mother used to make for his birthday every October. For a while, it seemed like it might be enough. Wyatt's numbers stabilized through that summer. Then, in the fall, they didn't, and the word transplant entered our house for the first time, spoken first in hushed phone calls between my parents late at night, then eventually at the dinner table, then eventually, months later, directly to me. The specific incident that should have told me everything, the one I only understood as foreshadowing much later, happened that same spring, before anyone had said the word transplant out loud. My mother sat me down at our kitchen table on a Tuesday after school and told me I'd be giving up my bedroom. "Just for a while," she said. "Wyatt needs to be close to the bathroom. His stomach's been bad." My room was down the hall from the only bathroom on the 2nd floor. Wyatt's was at the other end, near the stairs. I moved my bed into the unfinished half of our basement that same week, next to my father's tools and a chest freezer that hummed all night. I told myself it was temporary. It lasted 4 years. Nobody ever brought it up again, and I never asked because by the time I understood I probably could have asked, it had already stopped feeling like something you were allowed to question. Wyatt went on a transplant list in June of that year. The wait for a deceased donor liver, especially for someone his blood type, ran 12 to 18 months on average, sometimes longer, and Dr. Okafor's predecessor, a man named Dr. Harmon, told my parents in a meeting I wasn't in, but heard about later, that Wyatt's numbers wouldn't hold that long. A living donor was the faster path. A living donor could give a segment of their own liver, and both halves would regenerate over the following months into 2 working organs. My father wasn't a match. match. My mother wasn't a match. An aunt, my mother's younger sister Carla, offered and tested and wasn't compatible either. I was 12 when they found out I was a match. Compatible blood type, healthy liver, good size ratio for a segment transplant. Nobody said anything to me directly for 2 more years. I only found out because I overheard my parents in the kitchen one night in 8th grade. My mother crying into the phone to her sister saying she's the only one who can save him and she doesn't even know it yet. I remember standing on the basement stairs in the dark holding the railing, understanding for the first time that I had already been chosen for something before I was ever asked. By the time I turned 14, in October of 2020, Wyatt's numbers had dropped into what Dr. Harmon called the danger window. My parents sat me down in the living room on a Sunday night. My father did most of the talking that time, which should have told me how serious it was, because my father almost never talked about anything that mattered. We wouldn't ask if there was another way, he said. You're already a match, my mother said. The doctor said kids can do it. Kids your age have done it for siblings. I asked what would happen to me. My mother answered before the surgeon could in a follow-up call 2 days later, saying it was routine, safe, that donors bounce back in 6 to 8 weeks, that I'd barely noticed the scar in a year. I was 14. I believed the person who'd raised me over the fine print I was too young to fully parse. I said yes in November, 3 weeks after Thanksgiving, in a hospital conference room with my mother's hand on my shoulder and my father standing by the door like he couldn't bring himself to sit. The surgery happened on December 3rd, 2020, at Cincinnati Children's Hospital. I remember the smell of the pre-op room, sharp and clean, and a nurse named Denise Marsh, who held my hand and told me I was one of the bravest patients she'd ever met. And I remember thinking that bravery had never actually been offered to me as a choice I got to decline. They removed the left lateral segment of my liver, roughly 20% of it, and transplanted it into Wyatt in a 12-hour surgery 2 rooms away. I woke up in a recovery ward with a 6-inch incision across my abdomen and a fentanyl drip that didn't touch the pain for the first 18 hours. I spent 9 days in the hospital. Wyatt spent 16. My parents split their time unevenly. My mother stayed in Wyatt's room almost the entire 9 days I was there, coming to check on me for 20-30 minutes at a stretch, always with the same question first. Not how are you feeling? Always. Did you see him yet? Do you know how he's doing? My father sat with me more, but even he checked his phone every few minutes for updates from my mother about Wyatt's numbers. On day 6, a nurse named Priya, not the same nurse as before, adjusted my dressing and told me, gently, that regeneration in a 14-year-old's liver could take up to a year to fully complete, and that I should avoid contact sports, heavy lifting, and alcohol for at least that long. I asked her if my parents knew that. She said it should have been in my discharge paperwork. When I got home and looked, it was on page 4 of a packet nobody had read to me out loud. I missed 6 weeks of 9th grade. My mother wrote a note to the school explaining I'd had a medical procedure, using the word procedure instead of surgery, the way you'd describe a filling instead of a root canal. When I came back, a few kids asked if I'd been sick. I said yes. It felt easier than explaining that I'd handed over a piece of my body and gotten a thank you card signed by my mother in my brother's name, because he'd been too tired that week to sign it himself. Wyatt recovered faster than I did. By February, he was back at school, back on the junior varsity baseball team. By April, I was still getting winded walking up our driveway in March. Nobody in my house seemed to notice the difference in our timelines. To them, the surgery was a single event that had already happened and already succeeded, filed away and closed. To me, it was something my body was still doing, quietly, every single day, whether anyone was paying attention or not. The thing about a house like mine is that it doesn't run on cruelty exactly. It runs on math. Nobody says out loud. Wyatt was sick, so Wyatt's needs multiplied everyone else's by 0. I understood that math by instinct before I could have explained it in words. I got good at not needing things, because needing things in my house made you the second problem in a house that could only handle one problem at a time, and the first problem always had a hospital bracelet. For a while after the first surgery, that math seemed to work. Wyatt was healthy. My parents were less frightened, which made them briefly kinder. There was a stretch of about a year, from the spring I turned 15 through the summer I turned 16, that I look back on now as the good years, even though I know that's a strange thing to call a year where I was still recovering from major abdominal surgery my parents barely tracked. It was the good years because nobody needed anything from me that I could still remember the cost of giving. During that stretch, my mother took me on a weekend trip to Columbus, just the 2 of us, to look at colleges even though I was only a sophomore and it was 2 years too early to matter. We stayed in a Best Western off I-71 and ate at a diner where she let me order a milkshake for breakfast. And for 2 days, I got to be a kid whose only medical history was a normal one. I remember thinking, in the car on the way home, that maybe the surgery had been a bridge to this, a single hard thing that brought us back to something ordinary. I didn't yet understand that the bridge only existed because Wyatt was, for that 1 year, staying compliant with a regimen he'd eventually abandon. There was a specific incident that spring that I didn't understand as a warning sign until much later. Wyatt came home from a party in April, 16 months after his transplant, smelling faintly of beer, and my mother found out because a friend's mother called her directly. My mother sat him down in the kitchen, the same table, and I listened from the basement stairs the way I had years before. She didn't yell. She cried and told him how scared she'd been, how close she'd come to losing him, and Wyatt apologized and promised it wouldn't happen again, and that was the entire consequence. No follow-up call to Dr. Okafor, no mention of it at his next quarterly blood work appointment, as far as I ever heard. My mother told my father it had been handled. I didn't think much of it at the time. I was 15, and it wasn't my liver getting tested that visit, and I'd already learned that Wyatt's problems were processed on a different track than everyone else's, one that ran through forgiveness instead of consequence. I filed it away without knowing I was filing anything at all. That ended in September of my junior year, when Wyatt, 19 by then, and a sophomore at a state college 2 hours away, came home for a weekend looking gray in the same way he had at 15. His liver enzymes had spiked. Dr. Okafor, who'd taken over Wyatt's case after Dr. Harmon retired, ran the labs and called it acute rejection, complicated by a secondary infection. The transplanted segment, the piece that had once been part of my body, was failing. He needed another transplant, and once again, I was the match. That was the version of events my parents gave me, sitting at the same kitchen table where they'd told me I'd be moving to the basement 4 years earlier. Acute rejection, bad luck, a body doing what bodies sometimes do, no one's fault, nothing anyone could have prevented. I believed that version for 3 more months, right up until the week everything else came apart. The first step in what came next was small enough that I almost let it go. 2 days after the consult room, my mother came into my room, the same basement room I'd lived in since I was 12, and sat on the edge of my bed like we were about to have a heart-to-heart instead of a negotiation. "I know the first time was scary," she said, "but you handled it. You're stronger now. This time will be easier." The nurse told me it could take a year for my liver to regrow last time, I said. It had only been 3 years. "Livers regenerate," my mother said, waving a hand like I'd brought up something irrelevant. "That's the whole point of them." Dr. Okafor explained all of this. Dr. Okafor had explained it to my parents. Nobody had explained anything to me directly except in a folder I hadn't opened yet. I asked my mother if I could talk to the doctor myself, without her in the room. My mother's face tightened. "Why would you need to do that?" she said. "It wasn't a question. We're your parents. We wouldn't let anyone tell you anything that wasn't true." I said I still wanted to. My mother stood up, said fine. She'd set it up, and left the room in a way that made it clear the request itself had been a small betrayal. The second step came 4 days later, when my father brought Wyatt's transplant coordinator, Denise Marsh, the same nurse who'd held my hand at 14, to our house for what my mother called a family conversation. Denise was kind, thorough, and clearly uncomfortable, the way people get when they've been placed in the middle of something they didn't choose. She explained the situation plainly. Wyatt's second liver, the one built from my tissue, was failing due to what the chart listed as chronic rejection, with a contributing hepatotoxic event. She used the word hepatotoxic twice. I asked what that meant specifically. "It means something toxic damaged the liver tissue," Denise said, on top of the rejection. "Toxic like what?" Denise glanced at my mother before she answered. "That's still being worked out," she said. "The important thing right now is finding Wyatt a new source." My mother jumped in before I could ask a follow-up. "The important thing is Delaney understanding that we need her again," she said, like I wasn't sitting 3 feet away, capable of understanding sentences aimed directly at me. The third step was the one that made me start writing things down, dates and phrases, in the notes app on my phone, because I'd started to notice that conversations in my house had a way of getting revised after the fact. My father took me to get ice cream alone, which hadn't happened in years, and I understood immediately it was a setup, the soft cop version of what my mother had already tried. "Your mother can come on too strong," he said, which was as close to an apology as my father ever offered for anyone in our family. "But she's not wrong that we need you. I need you too, Delaney. I can't watch him die. I already almost lost him once. I almost lost part of my body once," I said. "Nobody talks about that part." My father's jaw worked like he was chewing something tough. "That's not fair," he said. "You're comparing apples to a child's life." "I was a child too," I said. "I was 14. He didn't have an answer for that. He paid for the ice cream and drove me home mostly in silence, and I understood that the conversation had been logged in his mind not as something I'd said that had a point, but as something I'd said that proved I needed correcting. The fourth step arrived at Thanksgiving, 3 weeks after the ice cream, when my Aunt Carla and my grandmother, Nana Ruth, came for dinner. I hadn't planned on saying anything about the transplant request at the table, but my mother brought it up herself, over the mashed potatoes, in a tone that made it sound like she was updating relatives on a school project. "Delaney's still deciding," my mother said, "whether she's going to help her brother." Nana Ruth put her fork down. "Deciding," she repeated. "She needs a little push is all," my mother said, and looked at me, and I understood I was supposed to nod along, to perform the reluctant heroine coming around to duty in front of an audience. I didn't nod along. "I gave part of my liver to him when I was 14, I said, to the whole table, because I'd never actually said it in front of anyone outside our immediate house before. Not like that, not as a fact instead of a footnote. Nobody's ever asked how I'm doing since. They're asking me to do it again, and I still don't fully understand why the first one failed." The table went quiet in the specific way tables go quiet when someone has said something true that other people had agreed, without discussing it, not to say. Nana Ruth reached over and took my hand, not the way my mother grabbed it, but gently, like she was checking it was still attached to me. "Nobody told me it was that serious the first time," Nana Ruth said, looking at my mother. "You said it was minor." "It wasn't minor," I said. "I was in the hospital for 9 days." My mother's face went went red. "This is not the conversation to have at Thanksgiving," she said, which was, I noticed, never something she said about conversations concerning Wyatt. "Renata," Nana Ruth said, using my mother's full first name, which she only did when she meant business. "You brought it up, not her." My mother's mouth pressed into a thin line. "I was just giving an update," she said. "Families talk about these things. Families also listen when someone answers honestly," Nana Ruth said. Instead of deciding the honest answer was rude timing, she turned to me, her voice softening. "How long have you been carrying this by yourself, sweetheart?" "Since I was 14, I said, and saying it out loud, at that table, in front of people who hadn't heard it before, was the first time the number had ever sounded as large to someone else as it had always felt to me. Aunt Carla, who'd offered her own liver years earlier and been rejected as a match because of an old surgery of her own that disqualified her, was quiet for most of dinner after that. But she caught me alone in the kitchen while I was rinsing dishes and asked, low enough that no one else could hear, whether I actually understood what I'd be agreeing to this time. She'd wanted to be the one to do it back when Wyatt first got sick, she told me, had gone through the testing process hoping it would spare me from ever being asked, and she still carried some quiet guilt about not being able to follow through on that. I told her I didn't, not fully, because nobody had explained it to me without also trying to talk me into it in the same breath. "That's not right," Carla said. "You should have your own doctor, not theirs. Someone whose only job is looking out for you." I didn't know such a thing existed for organ donors until she said it. It's called an independent living donor advocate, a person whose entire role by federal transplant policy is to represent the donor's interests separately from the recipient's medical team, with no obligation to the family pushing for the surgery. Nobody in my family had ever mentioned this existed. Not the first time, not the second. The fifth step came the week after Thanksgiving when my mother enlisted my best friend Marin Okafor, no relation to the doctor, in the effort. I found out because Marin, who I'd known since 4th grade, called me crying, apologizing, saying my mother had shown up at her house without warning, and asked her to talk sense into me, to remind me what kind of person I wanted to be. "She showed you pictures of him," Marin said, "from the hospital, from when he was little." I asked her to describe them. My mother had brought printed photos from a bin she kept in the hall closet, pictures of Wyatt at 9, at 11, laughing, healthy, a version of him from before Wilson's disease had a name in our house, and had shown them to my 17-year-old friend on her own front porch, like evidence in a trial I hadn't agreed to stand for. Marin said she didn't know what to do, that my mother had cried the whole time, that she'd felt cornered into promising she'd talk to me even though she didn't actually think I was doing anything wrong. "You're not," I told her. "I'm sorry she put you in the middle of it." "I think she's really scared," Marin said, which was true, and which I already knew, and which had stopped, somewhere in the last month, being an excuse that covered everything else. When I confronted my mother about going to Marin's house, she didn't deny it. "I'm trying every avenue I have left," she said, like recruiting my friends was a reasonable next-line item on a checklist, no different from calling the pharmacy or scheduling an appointment. I told her that using my own friendships as leverage against me felt like a new low, and she said, without any apparent irony, that she wouldn't have had to if I'd just said yes the first time she'd asked. The sixth step, the one that finally broke something open, happened 2 weeks later, in early December, almost exactly 3 years to the day since my first surgery. I'd requested, through Dr. Okafor's office, my own donor advocate, a woman named Renee Castillo, and my first meeting with her was scheduled for a Tuesday afternoon. My mother found out about the appointment from a confirmation email that came to our shared family calendar, and she was in my room before I'd even taken off my school shoes. "You went behind our backs," she said. "I made an appointment with a nurse whose entire job is talking to me," I said. "That's not behind your back. That's the opposite of what you've been doing to me for a month. We are your parents," my mother said, her voice climbing. "We have never once done anything except try to save your brother's life." "You keep saying that like it answers the question," I said. "I'm not asking if you love him. I'm asking why the second liver failed, and nobody in this house has given me a straight answer yet." My mother stood in my doorway for a long moment, and something in her face shifted, not into honesty exactly, but into a kind of exhaustion that looked, for the first time in weeks, less like performance and more like fear. "Because it doesn't matter why," she finally said. "What matters is, he needs another one, and you're the only person who can give it to him." I looked at her and understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, that she had just told me the truth by accident. It didn't matter why the second liver had failed, not to her. All that mattered was the supply chain continuing to run through my body, regardless of what had broken it the first time. I didn't say anything else. I closed my door, and for the first time since the consult room, I opened the folder Dr. Okafor had given me and actually read it, every page, twice. Quick pause from the story. If you enjoy these stories, consider taking a listen to our Spotify show linked in the description for early access to new stories in better audio quality. Now back to the video. Buried on page 6, in a section labeled Prior Graft Outcome Summary, was a phrase I hadn't heard anyone in my family say out loud: non-adherence to post-transplant regimen, patient reported. I didn't understand the clinical language well enough to know exactly what it meant, so I did what I'd learned to do that fall. I stopped trusting my parents to translate it for me, and I found someone else who would. I texted Renee Castillo, my new donor advocate, and asked if I could move our Tuesday appointment up. She called me back within the hour. Renee met me at a coffee shop near school instead of the hospital, which she said she preferred for first conversations. So somewhere that didn't smell like the thing we were talking about. She was maybe 50, with reading glasses pushed up into gray hair, and she let me talk for 10 straight minutes before she said anything at all. When I finally showed her the phrase from page 6, she nodded like she'd expected it. Non-adherence means the patient wasn't following the treatment plan, she said. It's usually missed medications. Sometimes it's diet. Sometimes it's substance use that interferes with the anti-rejection drugs. Substance use, I repeated. I can't tell you what it was in Wyatt's specific case, she said. That's protected under his own medical privacy, even from you, even though you're his donor. But I can tell you that the phrase doesn't appear in a chart unless it was documented by a provider, which means someone official noted it. More than once, probably. I thought about the ice cream with my father, the word bad luck. I thought about acute rejection, complicated by a secondary infection. The phrase my mother had used at the kitchen table, like she'd memorized it off a card. Nobody had said hepatotoxic event to me without also, in the same breath, steering me away from asking what had caused it. I went home that night and did something I'd never done before. I went into Wyatt's room while he was at physical therapy, and my parents were both still at work. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I told myself I just wanted to see if there was anything, a pill bottle out of place, a receipt, something that would either confirm or kill the shape forming in my head. What I found was on his desk, half buried under a stack of textbooks he clearly hadn't opened since coming home sick. A folded printout of a text conversation, the kind you get when you screenshot messages and then, for some reason, print them, maybe to show someone, maybe to keep as proof. It was between Wyatt and a friend from college named Dallas Kepler, from a stretch of messages that spanned late August into early September, right before Wyatt's numbers had spiked. I read 4 exchanges before I made myself stop, because reading more felt like something I couldn't undo. Dallas asking if Wyatt was still coming to the tailgate. Wyatt saying he wasn't supposed to drink on the new meds, but 1 beer wouldn't do anything. Dallas joking that Wyatt had been saying 1 beer since July. Wyatt sending back a laughing emoji and a photo I didn't open. I sat on the edge of his bed for a long time after that, holding a piece of paper that explained, in his own handwriting adjacent digital shorthand, why a segment of my liver had failed inside his body. Not bad luck, not something no one could have prevented. A choice repeated over weeks by someone who had been told explicitly not to make it. Someone who had watched his own sister go through a 12-hour surgery to give him the organ he was now treating like it came with a receipt and a return policy. I put the papers back exactly where I found them and left the room before anyone got home. That night I couldn't sleep, so I did something that felt small at the time, but that I now think of as the actual turning point of that entire year. I made a timeline. I opened a blank document on my laptop and wrote down every date I could remember, going back to the first diagnosis in 8th grade, and next to each date I wrote what I'd been told at the time. And next to that, in a second column, what I now suspected might actually have been true. The gap between the 2 columns, once I laid it out in front of me in plain text, was wider than I'd let myself see while I was living inside it, one conversation at a time. November 2020, told it was routine, minor, 6 to 8 weeks recovery. Actually major surgery, incomplete disclosure, no independent advocate offered. April, sophomore year, told a party incident had been handled. Actually unclear what handling meant, no documented follow-up that I ever heard of. September, junior year, told acute rejection, bad luck, nobody's fault. Actually, per Wyatt's own chart, non-adherence, hepatotoxic event, patient reported. Seeing it laid out like that, I understood something I hadn't fully let myself understand while I was still inside the fog of it. This wasn't one bad decision by my parents, made under pressure, that I could forgive as an isolated lapse. It was a pattern, 3 years long, of managing information around me instead of through me. Every single time the truth might have required them to ask harder questions or admit a mistake. I closed the laptop somewhere around 1 in the morning and lay in the basement dark for a long time, feeling less angry than I expected, and more like something had simply clicked into a shape it had probably always been. I called Renee Castillo again the next morning before school and read her the timeline over the phone. She was quiet for a moment when I finished. I want to be careful here, she said, because I'm your advocate, not your parents' judge. But I'll say this. What you're describing is a pattern where your consent, both times, was obtained without the information a reasonable person would need to actually consent. That matters. It's not just an emotional grievance. It's the actual standard informed consent is supposed to meet, and from what you're telling me, it wasn't met either time. I asked her what that meant for what I should do now. She said that was mine to decide, that her job was making sure I had the facts, not making the decision for me, which was, I realized, the first time in the entire ordeal that an adult had said that sentence to me and actually meant it. I didn't confront anyone that night. I sat with it for 2 days, because I wanted to be sure, and because some small, stubborn part of me was hoping I'd misread it, that there was an innocent explanation, that Wyatt had stopped after that one text, and the damage had come from somewhere else entirely. On the 3rd day, I called Denise Marsh, the transplant coordinator, and asked her directly, as calmly as I could manage, whether alcohol use had contributed to the failure of Wyatt's second liver. There was a pause on the line long enough that I knew the answer before she gave it. I'm not able to discuss another patient's specific history with you, Denise said gently, even as his donor, but I will tell you that adherence counseling was part of his care plan after the first transplant, and that counseling exists because it's needed in a meaningful number of cases. Was it needed in his case? I said. Yes or no? Another pause. Delaney, she said, I think you should talk to your parents about this. I already had my answer. Denise wasn't going to violate Wyatt's privacy by confirming it outright, but she also hadn't told me I was wrong. And in 3 years of working with my family, she had never once failed to correct me when I was wrong about something. Her silence was its own kind of confirmation, the kind adults give you when they legally can't say yes, but morally can't bring themselves to say no. I thought about the consult room. I thought about my mother's hand on mine, squeezing, saying you're the only one who can save him, like the first surgery had simply worn out on its own, like a car needing new brakes instead of a gift that had been driven recklessly into the ground. I thought about page 6 of the folder, the phrase sitting there in black and white the entire time, available to anyone in my family who'd been willing to actually open the packet and read it to me instead of narrating around it. They had known, not maybe known, not suspected. The chart said patient reported, which meant Wyatt himself had told a doctor, at some point, what he'd been doing. My parents had access to that same chart. They had sat across from me at a kitchen table and a consult room and an ice cream shop and told me over and over that this was simply what bodies did, no one's fault, when the truth had been documented, dated, and available to them the entire time. The confrontation happened on a Sunday, 5 days before I was supposed to give my final answer. I asked my parents and Wyatt to sit down together in the living room, the same room where they'd first told me about the second transplant. Wyatt looked thinner than he had at Thanksgiving, his skin still carrying that faint yellow tint that never fully left him anymore. Part of me, even then, still ached for him, still remembered him teaching me to ride a bike in the church parking lot when I was 6 and he was 9. That part of me didn't disappear just because I'd found what I'd found. It just stopped being the only part of me in the room. I read the printout on your desk, I told Wyatt, and watched his face go from confused to pale in under 2 seconds. The one with Dallas, from August. You went through my stuff, Wyatt said. You went through mine 3 years ago and kept wearing my liver like it was a spare part, I said. I think we're past the point where going through each other's stuff is the scandal here. My mother's head snapped toward Wyatt. What printout? She said. And I understood in that one sharp question that this specific detail was news to her, even if the broader shape wasn't. It doesn't matter, Wyatt said. It was one time. It wasn't one time, I said. It's in your chart. Non-adherence to post-transplant regimen. That's not a phrase they write down for one beer at a tailgate. Denise wouldn't confirm it to me directly, but she also didn't deny it. And I've known her long enough to know what her silence means. My father's face had gone very still, the way it did right before he got angry, except this time the anger had nowhere obvious to land, because for once the person who'd created the crisis was sitting 3 feet away from him, instead of hiding in a hospital chart. Wyatt, my father said low. Is this true? Wyatt's jaw tightened. You don't understand what it's like, he said to all of us, but mostly, I think, to me. Everyone treats me like I'm made of glass. I just wanted one normal weekend. I didn't think one drink would do anything. You knew it wasn't one drink, I said. Dallas's text said you'd been saying that since July. My mother's hands were shaking. I watched her look at Wyatt, then at me, then back at Wyatt, doing the math I'd been watching her do my entire life, except this time the equation wasn't balancing the way it always had. For the first time, the person who needed protecting and the person who'd caused the damage were the same person, and she didn't have a script for that. You told us it was rejection, my mother said to Wyatt, her voice cracking. You told the doctors it was rejection. It was partly rejection, Wyatt said, which was, I realized later, the closest thing to an admission he ever gave any of us in that room. The drinking just made it worse. That's not the same as causing it. It's in the exact same sentence in your chart, I said. Rejection with a contributing hepatotoxic event. You caused the event. You could have just told me, I said to Wyatt, and my voice cracked for the first time that whole conversation. Before any of this, you could have called me yourself and said, I messed up. I drank when I wasn't supposed to. I'm scared to tell mom and dad. I would have been angry. I would have understood. What I can't forgive is finding out from a printed text conversation because everyone in this house decided I was safer left in the dark. I didn't want you to look at me differently, Wyatt said, quieter now, some of the anger draining out of him. You already gave me a piece of yourself. I didn't want you to know I wasted it. I don't look at you differently because you made a mistake, I said. I look at you differently because you let me walk into a second surgery still believing the first one just failed on its own. That's not the same thing as being ashamed. That's letting someone volunteer for something under false pretenses. My mother wiped her face with the back of her hand, and when she spoke again, her voice had lost the sharp, managing tone she'd used for weeks. I told myself I was protecting both of you, she said. I didn't want Wyatt to feel like a failure, and I didn't want you to feel like you'd wasted what you gave him. I thought if I just kept moving forward, it would matter less how we got here. It matters more, I said, because now I don't know which parts of anything you've told me for the last 3 years were true, and which parts were just the version that kept things moving forward. Nobody spoke for a long moment. My father put his head in his hands, elbows on his knees, and for the first time since I'd known him, he looked genuinely unmoored, like a man who'd built his understanding of his own family on a foundation that had just been quietly hollowed out from underneath him for months without his knowledge. I'm not doing it again, I said, into the silence. I gave you 20% of my liver when I was 14 because I trusted that you'd take care of it. You didn't. I'm not doing it a second time so you can decide, again, whether following your own doctor's instructions is worth the effort. That's not fair, Wyatt said, his voice climbing now, the first real anger I'd heard from him in the conversation. You're going going to let me die over one mistake. I'm not letting you do anything, I said. You made a choice. More than one, actually, according to your own friend's texts. I'm making mine. Mine is that I'm not a renewable resource for you to keep drawing from every time you decide the rules don't apply to you. My mother started crying. The real kind this time, not the performative kind she'd used at the consult room. How can you say that about your own brother? She said. How could you say I was selfish for hesitating? I said back. When you knew the whole time exactly why the first one failed and decided it was easier to ask me for a second one than to tell me the truth about the first. That was the sentence that finally landed the way I'd needed it to for weeks. I watched it hit my mother, watched something in her face crumble that had nothing to do with Wyatt's liver and everything to do with the fact that her own daughter had just described accurately exactly what she'd done. My father didn't defend her. He didn't defend Wyatt either. He just sat there with his head in his hands, saying nothing, which was its own kind of answer. The days after that Sunday didn't resolve into anything clean. Families don't work that way, whatever the version of this story that airs on daytime television might suggest. What happened instead was a slow, ugly unraveling that took the better part of the following year. My mother didn't speak to me for 11 days. She moved through the house like I was a stranger she was being forced to house, answering direct questions in single syllables, leaving rooms when I entered them. My father tried, clumsily, to stay neutral, which in practice meant he mostly avoided both of us and buried himself in work at the shop. Wyatt went back to his college apartment 2 weeks earlier than planned, and from what I heard through my mother's occasional resentful updates, he stopped answering his family's calls almost entirely for a while, angry that I'd exposed something he clearly hoped would stay buried. My mother's desperation didn't end the day of the confrontation. 2 weeks later, she showed up unannounced at Renee Castillo's office, asking to speak with her directly, trying to argue that as my mother, she had a right to be present for any conversation about my medical decisions, even though I was still legally a minor and had every right to a private consultation with my own advocate. Renee, by her own account when she told me about it afterward, calmly explained the relevant policy and asked my mother to leave, which she eventually did, but not before telling the front desk staff loudly enough that Renee could hear from her office that this entire advocate system was designed to turn children against their parents. It was, I think, the last real attempt my mother made to control the narrative before she finally, exhaustedly, stopped fighting it. Something in her seemed to give out after that. Not into acceptance exactly, but into a kind of depleted quiet that lasted most of the winter. Family sides split in ways that surprised me. My father's brother, my uncle Marcus, who I'd always thought of as closer to my dad than anyone, sided almost entirely with my mother and Wyatt, telling my father at a Super Bowl gathering in February that he was, in Marcus's words, letting one bad semester define a kid who'd nearly died twice. My father didn't argue with him, which told me something about where my father's own convictions still sat, somewhere between defending me and keeping peace with his brother. Nana Ruth, by contrast, stopped speaking to Marcus almost entirely after that comment, a rift in the family that, as far as I know, still hasn't fully healed. Aunt Carla's husband, my uncle by marriage, a quiet man named Robert who rarely weighed in on anything, sent me a card in December. No explanation attached, just a short note that said he was proud of me for asking questions most people wouldn't have had the nerve to ask. I still have it in a drawer in my apartment in Columbus. Nana Ruth became the person I talked to most that fall. She called me every Sunday night, a standing appointment neither of us ever mentioned out loud, and she never once told me I was wrong. She did tell me gently in November that she'd spoken to a lawyer friend of hers, unprompted, about whether what had happened to me at 14, the pressure, the incomplete information, the missing donor advocate, constituted something worth pursuing. I told her I didn't want to sue my own parents. She said she understood, but that she wanted me to know the option existed, because too many people in my position never found out it did, until it was too late to matter. Aunt Carla became an unexpected ally in a different way. She'd been the one to tell me an independent advocate existed in the first place, and once the truth came out, she stopped being quiet at family gatherings the way she had been at Thanksgiving. She told my mother, in a conversation I wasn't in the room for but heard about from Nana Ruth, that she'd watched Renata push me toward the second surgery for weeks without once asking what the first one had actually cost me, and that she wasn't going to keep pretending she hadn't noticed. The financial complications added their own layer of ugliness. My parents had, over the 3 years since my first surgery, spent nearly $40,000 in out-of-pocket medical costs on Wyatt's care, on top of what insurance covered, money that came partly from a home equity line of credit and partly from a college fund that had originally been split between Wyatt and me. When I found out, in a conversation with my father in January, that my share of that fund had been reduced from an original $11,000 to just under $3,000, redirected without my knowledge to cover costs connected to the same second transplant I'd ultimately refused to make possible, something in me went cold in a way the confrontation itself hadn't managed. You used my own college money to pay for treatment I said no to, I told him. It wasn't like that, my father said. The costs happened before you said no. We didn't know yet that you would. You didn't ask, I said. You assumed, the same way you assumed at 14. He didn't have an answer for that either. My father, I came to understand that Winter wasn't a cruel man. He was a tired one who had spent years making decisions under pressure and had gotten gotten so used to making them without consulting me that it had stopped registering to him as a choice at all. That understanding didn't make the $3,000 reappear, but it did let me be angry at him without hating him, which turned out to matter more than I expected. I filed, with Nana Ruth's help and the number from her lawyer friend, a request through the county to have my remaining share of the fund legally protected from further redirection, something a family court clerk told me was more common than I would have guessed, especially in families with a chronically ill sibling. It wasn't a lawsuit, it was a document, notarized, that made it harder for my parents to make similar decisions about my money without my direct written consent going forward. My mother called it a betrayal when she found out. Nana Ruth, when I told her that, said some betrayals are just the first time you're finally allowed to say no and have it hold. My parents tried family therapy in March, at Nana Ruth's insistence, with a counselor named Dr. Patel who worked out of an office above a dry cleaner in Kettering. We went 4 times. The first session, my mother spent most of the 50 minutes explaining Wyatt's medical history in exhaustive detail, as though Dr. Patel needed to be convinced of the severity of his illness before she'd be allowed to address anything else. Dr. Patel gently redirected her twice, asking instead how the family had made decisions about my body specifically, and both times my mother pivoted back to Wyatt's numbers, his labs, the danger window, like the question itself didn't fully register as being about me. By the third session, my father started talking more than he ever had in 20 years of raising us, admitting haltingly that he'd let my mother make most of the decisions about my first surgery because he hadn't known how to argue with a woman who was that frightened, and that he understood now that his silence had functioned as a kind of consent he'd never actually examined. It wasn't an apology exactly. Dr. Patel called it an opening. My mother cried through most of that session too, but a different kind of crying than the consult room kind. Quieter, less performed. We stopped going after the 4th session, not because it wasn't helping, but because Wyatt refused to attend even once. And my mother eventually admitted she found it too hard to keep going without him there to explain his side. School that spring was its own kind of complication. I was a junior, supposed to be visiting colleges and studying for the ACT, and instead I was spending afternoons in Renee Castillo's office or on the phone with a family court clerk in Montgomery County, filling out forms about a college fund that had been quietly halved without my signature on anything. My guidance counselor, a woman named Ms. Alvarez, noticed my grades slipping in February and pulled me aside after AP biology to ask if everything was okay at home. I told her a version of the truth, enough that she understood I wasn't being dramatic, and she helped me apply for an extension on 2 overdue assignments, without ever asking for details I wasn't ready to give a teacher. It was a small kindness, but it mattered. The way small kindnesses from people outside a broken system tend to matter more than you'd expect. I ended up finishing that junior year with a B+ average, instead of the A- I'd been tracking toward all fall, a small, unremarkable statistic that nobody in my house ever asked about. One more piece of collateral damage too minor to register against the scale of everything else that year had cost. The financial complications kept surfacing that spring, layered and slow, the way real financial damage usually is instead of the single dramatic reveal it becomes in movies. In April, I discovered that my parents had also taken out a second loan against the house, $9,000, the previous October, right around the time Wyatt's numbers had first spiked, and had never mentioned it to me even though I was, at that point, still a minor, whose future they were nominally supposed to be protecting. My father explained it as a bridge loan, meant to be repaid once Wyatt's disability claim came through, and technically it had nothing to do with my college fund specifically, but the timeline made something clear to me that no one had said outright. My family had been financially bracing for a second surgery, mine, for months, running numbers and taking out debt against a decision I hadn't actually agreed to yet, as if my consent had always been assumed rather than requested. I asked my father directly whether the loan would have been necessary if I'd said no from the start, back in November, before any of the pressure began. He was quiet for a long moment before he answered. "We didn't think you'd say no," he said. "We didn't plan for that version." That sentence, more than almost anything else that year, told me exactly where I'd stood in my family's imagination. Not as a person who might reasonably decline a second major surgery after the first one had been mishandled, but as a resource whose eventual yes was assumed so completely that an entire financial plan had been built around it months in advance. There was a moment that winter, in February, that I still think about more than almost anything else from that year. Wyatt called me, out of nowhere, on a Tuesday night. He didn't apologize, not exactly, but he asked if I remembered teaching him how to skip rocks at the lake when I was 8, which I didn't, because it had been the other way around he'd taught me. But I understood he was reaching for something, some memory of us as kids before any of this, before livers and charts and donor advocates, before he became a diagnosis I was medically linked to and I became a resource he was entitled to draw from. I told him I remembered the lake. I didn't correct the detail about who taught whom. We talked for 11 minutes about nothing important, and then he said he had to go, and neither of us mentioned the transplant or the printout or the 11 days our mother hadn't spoken to me. It wasn't a reconciliation. It was smaller than that, and sadder. A brief flicker of the siblings we might have been in a family that hadn't organized itself from the moment his diagnosis arrived, entirely around his survival at any cost to mine. An unexpected message came in April from Dallas Kepler, Wyatt's college friend whose printed text text conversation had cracked the whole thing open. He found my number through a mutual friend and messaged to say he'd heard secondhand some version of what had happened and that he felt sick about it, that he hadn't understood at the time how serious Wyatt's situation actually was, that to him it had just looked like a friend blowing off steam at a tailgate the way everyone did. He apologized for something that hadn't really been his to apologize for, and I told him that. He wasn't the one who'd hidden a chart entry from a 17-year-old for 3 months. Still, it meant something that he reached out at all, that a near stranger felt more accountable in 5 minutes than my own parents had in 5 months. We talked for a while about Wyatt, carefully, and Dallas mentioned that he'd since cut back on drinking around Wyatt entirely, not out of guilt exactly, he said, but because watching the fallout had made him take seriously something he'd never had a reason to take seriously before. It wasn't closure, it was something smaller and stranger, a reminder that consequences sometimes reach people who were never the ones being asked to give up part of their body. Wyatt eventually did get a third liver, 10 months after that Sunday, from the deceased donor list, after a mandatory 6-month sobriety and adherence program that Dr. Okafor's transplant committee required before relisting him, a requirement I later learned existed specifically because of cases like his. The program included regular toxicology screens, mandatory counseling, and a signed adherence contract, the kind of structure that should have existed after his first transplant and simply hadn't, because nobody with the authority to require it had known there was a reason to. He's alive. As far as I know, he's been sober and compliant since. I'm glad, in the complicated, distant way you can be glad for someone you love and no longer fully trust in the same uncomplicated way you used to. I wasn't at the hospital for that surgery. I found out it had happened from a text my mother sent 2 days after the fact, which felt in its own quiet way like the most honest thing anyone in my family had done in the entire ordeal. She didn't ask me to be there. She didn't need to. I sent back a single line, glad he's okay, and meant it. And that was the whole exchange. And somehow that felt more real than any of the long managed conversations we'd had in the 2 years before it. There was a smaller moment of grief that spring that I didn't expect, one that had nothing to do with Wyatt directly. I drove past our old church parking lot in May, the one where he'd taught me to ride a bike when I was 6, and I had to pull over for a few minutes because I was crying harder than I had at any point during the actual confrontation. I wasn't grieving the transplant or the money or even the lying exactly. I was grieving a version of my family that I understood. Sitting in that parking lot had probably never fully existed the way I remembered it, that even the good years I held on to so carefully had been built on a foundation where my needs were negotiable and Wyatt's weren't. And I'd simply been too young and too loved, in whatever limited way I was loved, to notice the difference until it nearly cost me a second surgery I never should have been asked to give. I'm 19 now. I live in Columbus, 2 hours from Dayton, in a shared apartment near campus with a roommate named Josie, who has never once, in the year and a half we've lived together, asked anything of my body except that I not leave dishes in the sink. That sounds like a small thing to be grateful for. It isn't. I'm studying to become a physician assistant, a choice I made partly because of everything I went through, though not in the way people usually assume. I didn't fall in love with medicine because it saved my brother. I went into it because I watched, up close, how easily a hospital chart can carry a truth that the people around you decide you don't need to hear, and I wanted to be the kind of provider who tells patients the whole page, not just the parts that keep them compliant. I volunteer some Saturdays at a transplant support clinic near campus, mostly doing intake paperwork, but I've made it a habit to ask every young donor I meet, gently, whether anyone has explained to them that they're allowed to have their own advocate, separate from the family asking them for the gift. Most of them don't know. I make sure they leave knowing. The independent living donor advocate requirement wasn't new when I finally learned about it. It had existed in federal transplant policy for years before Renee Castillo's name ever came up in my life, buried in guidelines most families never hear mentioned out loud unless someone in the room already knows to ask. I think about that sometimes, how close I came to never learning that a version of protection had existed for me the entire time, simply because nobody with a reason to keep quiet had any incentive to tell me. I see my parents now, a few times a year, mostly around holidays and mostly at Nana Ruth's house, which has become a kind of neutral ground none of us ever agreed to out loud, but all of us respect. My mother and I are civil. We're not close, not the way we were before I turned 14, before my body became something negotiated over at a kitchen table instead of something that simply belonged to me. Last Christmas, she gave me a card, not the kind signed in someone else's handwriting this time, and inside it, she'd written that she was sorry for the parts she'd gotten wrong. Not all of it, but the parts. It wasn't everything I might have wanted. It was more than I expected, and I've learned this past year to let things be exactly as much as they are instead of grieving them for not being more. I don't know if we'll ever get all the way back to what we were. Some days I think we might. Most days I've made peace with the possibility that we won't, and that the peace itself is the closest thing to healing I'm going to get, and that it's enough. I still have the scar. It's faded to a thin silver line now, low across my abdomen, and most days I don't think about it at all. Some days, usually in the shower, catching it in the mirror by accident, I think about the 14-year-old who signed a folder she didn't fully understand because the people who were supposed to protect her told her it was the only right thing to do. I don't regret giving Wyatt part of my liver. I regret that no one ever asked me what what it cost, or checked in on what was left of me once the piece they wanted had already been taken. Sometimes I try to imagine how that consult room would have gone differently if my mother had let Dr. Okafor speak first, if the folder had been opened together instead of handed to me like a formality, if anyone in the room had asked me a single question about how I was doing before asking me for something. I don't know if I would have said yes or no in that version. I think that's the point. I never actually got to find out because the question was never really a question at all. It was a conclusion, dressed up to look like one. They called me selfish for hesitating the second time. I've turned that word over more times than I can count since, in the shower, in the car, on long drives back to Dayton, in the quiet gaps between classes where my mind still wanders back there without my permission. I don't think hesitating to give away another piece of yourself after watching the first piece get treated like it came with no strings and no cost is selfish. I think it's the first time in my life I finally understood that my body was mine to decide about, not a family resource to be drawn on whenever the crisis came back around, whenever the next test came back with numbers nobody wanted to see. I gave everything I had to give the first time freely, out of love, before I understood love wasn't supposed to require a second withdrawal to prove itself, and before I understood that a family's love for you can be entirely real and still, somehow, not be enough to make them ask the right questions when it matters most. I'm still here. I'm still whole, more or less, in the ways that count. That has to be enough, because for the first time in my life, it was actually my choice to decide that it was.